Imagine a person is split into two individuals. Each is able to form their own thoughts, memories, and experiences. Are they both the same person as the original? If not, who is the true successor? Which one is real? Philosopher David Lewis poses this question in his essay Survival and Identity, a concept that is mirrored in the film The Substance. He answers that both are the true successors of the original, stating that survival doesn't need strict identity. What matters is psychological continuity. Lewis argues that a person is comprised of a collection of temporal snapshots, which he terms person stages. These person stages are connected through an invisible thread, creating an individual's unique identity and continuous self. The Substance is fundamentally preoccupied with notions of the self and its fragmentation. This essay will explore the concept of identity across time, examining what triggers these visions of the self and analyzing how these versions of the self interact, loving, hating, destroying, and perceiving the other, both within the substance and in reality, and how the splintering of the self is linked to our relentless pursuit of an entirely unattainable standard of beauty, one that is profoundly and firmly embedded in the structure of our world. Since I am, for the most part, deeply opposed to watching trailers, my knowledge of the film pre-screening was pretty limited. I knew it was a body horror film written and directed by Coralie Fargeat that in some form intended to critique or discuss extreme female beauty standards. All of these elements were incredibly intriguing to me as a devoted fan of the body horror subgenre, which I explored in my previous video on Brandon Cronenberg's film Antiviral. And having deeply admired Fargeat's previous work, Revenge, The Substance became one of my most anticipated films of the year. I was excited to watch something that was unapologetically visceral and violent, that had the potential to illustrate and externalize the internal violent struggle of being a woman. It's a difficult and complex topic to discuss, and there are many films and books that attempt to discuss this, but many, unfortunately, tend to feel rather shallow and cliche. One film that I believe masterfully explores this idea is the Japanese film Helter Skelter, and I appreciated seeing scenes and shots in The Substance that felt perhaps inspired by the film, especially the ending. It has been so long since I have felt so internally divided about a film. I'm someone who has been deeply obsessed with horror since I was quite young, but over time, horror, an inherently transgressive genre, has become, at least to me, somewhat safe and watered down, likely for broader commercial appeal. So I have immense respect for this film's ambition and intensity, and how it has been able to be as disgusting as it desired and still reach a major mainstream audience. I hope that it shows production companies our desire for more intense horror, potentially steering the genre back to its roots. I also really appreciate the amount of practical effects used within the film. As a filmmaker myself, whose first film involved practical effects as well as prosthetics, of course in a much smaller way, I understand the challenges that they present. It's a significant undertaking, but in my opinion, the right choice, and echoes classic body horror films like Videodrome. The performances also were exceptional. I can't even begin to imagine the immense physical and mental strain on both of the main actresses, having to exist within such intense characters for months, while constantly reflecting on their own self-image, on top of the physical demands of everything that they are doing within the film and wearing prosthetics. Also, I understand how personal this film was for Coralie. Her direction and writing is incredible and inspiring, and as much as she is being compared to other directors for their similarities, she has really created her own distinct voice and world that I can see running through this film as well as her previous film, Revenge. Despite these elements of the film that I really loved, it still left me feeling quite conflicted for several reasons. Knowing that this was a film about beauty standards and the fear of aging, I assumed that it would delve deeper into the underlying societal issues, potentially offering those less familiar with these fears, those who don't experience it every single day of their lives, a visceral and personal experience. I hoped that this film would start discussions about the horror of the female experience, sparking discussions about how we can collectively move forward to change it. Perhaps this expectation was overly optimistic for a horror film, but still I was surprised by its lack of hope, answers, or even blame for these very real terrors. The film's opening touches on this, but the male characters in these positions of power, deeming her too old to be relevant, are such cartoonish caricatures of the real-life men she is trying to depict that it was really difficult to take them and their violence towards women seriously. And as the story progresses, it suggests that individuals would repeatedly choose the substance, trapped in a painful cycle. This leaves us questioning, how does this effectively critique the issue if we're left without hope or a hint of resolution? Was the intent simply to illustrate the violence that women's minds inflict upon themselves? Many of us are already much too aware of our inevitable fate, its looming presence breeding desperation and sadness, driving people in our own world to pursue their own version of the substance. The notion that this film serves as a mirror reflecting the internal violence women experience, as some critics propose, strikes me as potentially redundant. Many women live with an amplified version of this mirror, consuming a lot of space within their minds already. And the digital mirror that we carry around in our palms every day can often act as one too, as if the one haunting our brain wasn't torturous enough. Did we really need a third mirror that exists without any semblance of resolution? Does this film contribute to our understanding, or does it merely amplify existing anxieties without providing any sort of meaningful insight or solutions for change? I watched a lot of interviews in search of Coralie's motivation for the film. When questioned, she stated that she wanted to express how violent these thoughts of aging into non-existence had become, and that she needed to take them out and do something with them. It seems that she wanted to express her frustration, and perhaps to start the conversation about this overwhelming and violent fear of aging, so that more women could speak out about this through art or to each other. Alternatively, as Demi Moore suggests in interviews, the goal might be to heal ourselves rather than seeking external change. A lot of my views on this film were expressed in this specific review of the film by user Maya on Letterboxd. Conceptually, a movie has never been more timely. Through an incredible use of body horror, it visualizes an inner reckoning among women. What Demi Moore described in the Q&A following the film's North American premiere as internalized violence against the self. The substance takes "we suffer for vanity" to an entirely new level. The film attacks head-on women's self-consuming pursuit of beauty, or pitiful attempts to stall time. Elizabeth and Sue belong to different generations, occupy different bodies of different values to the patriarchal industry they operate in, yet both are compelled, at great danger to themselves, to be beautiful. Sue by staying in her own body, and Elizabeth by forgoing hers. What transpires is a cyclical feast upon the self, which may just lead to the total destruction of both women and the terror of the viewer. What gives me pause about the substance is where this terror comes from and what we are to do with it. Aging has taken a central focus on the internet as women tape their mouths before going to sleep and sip from customized straws to avoid the disfigurement of a wrinkle. More than ever, the inevitable aged female body feels invisible, and thus it's worth questioning whether body horror is the most productive tool for addressing its absence. On the topic of beauty, vanity and oppression are always undergoing a delicate balancing act. Whether our obsession with the self is a product of first world consumerism or of the cruel capitalist standard of patriarchy, whether women are to be shamed and punished for their narcissism or sympathized for it, the substance doesn't seem to know. Through the conventions of horror, we are invited more often to cringe away from her rapidly aging, disfigured body than we are to empathize with it. In the horror genre, the elderly female body has often been used as a tool for terror. Cameras dance across wrinkles, burst blood vessels, sagging breasts, knobbled hands and knees, curved spines, varicose veins, and ask the audience to scream. As I watched Elizabeth's aged body revealed to the rowdy Midnight Madness audience and listened to them scream as they were asked to do, I thought of my grandmother. I thought of my mother. and I thought of my own body and my fears towards it, and I felt very sad. The Substance is an absolute thrill of a movie, and a welcome addition to the body horror genre, but by exchanging much needed moments of empathy for spectacle, it risks contradicting the desperately important message it wishes to convey. As I was watching the film, I remember at multiple points being overwhelmed with this deep, somber feeling. It was strange that the movie that everyone had been speaking about being so gory and so terrifying, to the extent of making audience members faint or puke or leave the theater entirely, just felt heartbreaking to me. Yes, the editing and sound design created tension and excitement, and there were many shocking and visceral, gory moments. But it didn't deeply disgust me or terrify me, and again, I would like to state that I do watch a lot of horror, so perhaps I am a bit desensitized to violence in these films. But I had to wonder if the disgust that people were speaking of was disgust at the sight of an older woman's body. For many viewers, the underlying message of the film, which is already vague to begin with, becomes lost and buried for two major reasons. Firstly, the extremity of the body horror. Though it feels like an accurate representation of what it feels like to exist as a woman under these beauty standards, becomes the focal point of conversation rather than the film's intended message. Whether this is due to the film itself or our generation's penchant for labeling everything as the scariest or the most extreme, regardless, the discussions about the film seem fixated on the intensity of the gore or audience reactions, with less attention paid to the ideas explored through the body horror. The second being the extreme idolization of Sue. Despite her being one of two main characters, who are the same individual at the time of Sue's creation, just not physically, they share memories and experiences, and at the start are internally the same. Especially as Elizabeth descends into deterioration, the audience seems to lose sympathy for her and begin to root entirely for Sue. Online, I'm inundated with edits of Sue, discussions about emulating her appearance, or jokes about calling plastic surgeons post-viewing. This is frustrating, especially considering Sue isn't real in any form. Not only is she a fictional character, but Margaret Qualley underwent extensive training and wore prosthetics to achieve Sue's physique. Margaret has spoken about the psychological toll of embodying the film world's version of perfection, yet this ideal is now being romanticized and pursued. Ironically, a film meant to critique the self-inflicted violence women go through in pursuit of beauty has resulted in many missing the point and creating another unattainable beauty standard to lust after. In Survival and Identity, philosopher David Lewis asserts that change is vital for survival. There is no survival without change. However, The Substance presents a contrary perspective. While some compare Sue's character to cancer cells relentlessly persisting and surviving, I argue it's quite the opposite. Those who consume the substance in the film aren't seeking survival as Lewis describes, the kind normally associated with surviving through a disaster or being stranded alone on an island. Instead, they crave a permanent existence in a single idealized person stage, perpetually young, beautiful, healthy, and flawless, eternally unchanged. At the slightest sign of deterioration or progression to a new, less perfect person stage, these women willingly sacrifice their current self, chasing an unattainable, frozen state of perfection. This vividly illustrates how the pursuit of beauty standards, eternal youth, and resistance to change is synonymous with death. Both mentally and physically, one cannot survive this way. In our world, this manifests as envy of our past selves, loathing of our present selves for failing to maintain perfection, and repulsion at the sheer thought of our inevitable future form. Sue and Elizabeth seem to embody physical manifestations of past and present snapshots of a single self. This makes me think of videos I've seen online of people reflecting on old photographs, envying their former beauty and youth while simultaneously being able to recognize that their future selves will one day look back on their present selves with similar longing. It's strange to me how easily we can dissociate from past versions of ourselves. Women in particular have become consumed by hatred and envy, not just in comparison to others, but also when confronting younger versions of themselves. We view them as separate entities because they no longer exist, serving as eternal reminders of what we once were and have since lost. We are in constant competition, even with ourselves. As women, we are plagued with this awareness, at least at a certain age, that we are inevitably and quickly going to lose relevance in our world. In an interview, Coralie talks about this feeling. I had these massive thoughts that I had reached the age where I wasn't going to be useful or interesting to anyone anymore. The violence of those thoughts was so strong that I had to do something about it. Otherwise, it would totally destroy and crush me. In this quote, Coralie articulates what consumes the minds of most women as they age. This sense of approaching obsolescence. Sometimes it feels like women and men don't have the same lifespan. By our 40s or 50s, we seem to fade into irrelevance. This feeling seems to only be getting more intense as the years go by, propelled by innovations that have reshaped beauty standards, such as advancements in plastic surgery and the extreme normalization of fillers and Botox. In our current world, women are made to feel that surpassing the age of 25 renders them obsolete and irrelevant. There will always be someone younger and more beautiful to take your place. It's alarming to witness the impact of this mentality on women and how beauty standards continue to evolve down an increasingly dark path. I've seen so many videos talking about preventative Botox, which is when young women and girls get Botox or filler to prevent wrinkles. This concept, likely fabricated by plastic surgeons to instill insecurities in young women, thus leeching off of the insecurities of women at all ages, not just those who are older, siphoning money from them and also making them obsessed with the fact that at some point, sooner than they think, they will become wrinkly, old, sagging, and irrelevant. A fate that plastic surgeons and our society as a whole make out to be worse than death. In interviews for the film, Demi Moore offers an interesting perspective on this process of aging into obsolescence.
I've had my own journey around placing a lot of value, especially when I was younger, on my body and what it looked like, and that if it wasn't thin, that I was less valuable. But what I've come to really see, and I do believe it is an ongoing journey. Like, we come up against things, but there's a couple of things, which is, we have the circumstances of our collective consciousness that has for a long time seen women's value as diminishing as they age, as there being certain, idealized body types, faces, looks that are, more desirable than others. But at the end of the day, I feel that all of that is in service to us, that it's happening for us, not to us, that it is there essentially so that we can actually get to the place that is of self-love and self-acceptance. Because, what other people do or don't do is irrelevant. How we hold it is everything, and that's what creates our reality and our experience.
While I don't agree that the burden of beauty standards is in service to women, I find it to be quite the opposite. I do appreciate and find hope in her ability to find inner peace and strength, rendering these external beliefs irrelevant to her. I hope many of us can find a way to cultivate such inner confidence and resilience. But I do find it important to speak about, and wish that the film had included more about this, how deeply ingrained this beauty standard is in our society and the very real, severe effects that it has on women and even young girls. Women know that they benefit from beauty, and they know they enjoy some of the practices of beauty and some of the successes and rewards of beauty. Moreover, they know that they will suffer if they do not engage. They will be dismissed, ignored, and criticized. For most women in most contexts, rejecting beauty expectations is not possible, and it would not be advisable. To understand and respond to the beauty ideal, we need to address it as it is actually functioning. It is not wholly harmful or wholly creative, but whatever else the beauty ideal is, it is serious, important, and powerful, and it becomes far more powerful as it becomes ethical. It is true that in our society, women who are beautiful are often given better opportunities and treated more favorably. From a young age, we are essentially brainwashed into believing that beauty equates to goodness, while ugliness is associated with evil. This notion is perpetuated in fairy tales where the eternally youthful and beautiful princess is antagonized by an evil, unattractive older woman who seeks to steal her life or beauty. As we grow up, we begin to link beauty with morality, effort, and cleanliness, and through advertisements and media, we are conditioned to pursue it. This belief is ingrained in us from such an early age that rejecting or escaping it becomes incredibly challenging. Consequently, there can be severe negative treatment, judgment, and rejection from families and communities for failing to conform to this beauty standard. With the invention and evolution of social media, I feel as though we've entered a dystopian future when it comes to self-perception and beauty standards. This seemingly natural progression stems from being constantly surrounded by mirrors, phones, cameras, and so many screens, creating relentless pressure to perform, especially for women. TikTok, which seems to now be the dominant social media platform, has created one of the most toxic online environments that I've ever experienced. Comments are cruel and blunt, with unprompted remarks about age and perceived flaws flooding the comment sections of videos that have nothing to do with beauty in the first place. I'm not sure if it's just the environment that has been created on the app or whether it is another indicator of the ever-shifting, intensifying societal beauty standard that we all suffer under. There have been various trends on the app that show what I have been discussing in this essay so far. I have seen videos where people talk about how celebrities that are perceived to be kind age gracefully while the problematic celebrities age horribly. Another indicator that many people, from the way that we were raised and the ideas that were ingrained in our mind, are made to believe that beauty equates to goodness and thus ugliness is evil. Morning sheds show the extent that women will go to wake up looking immediately presentable, although to me it seems as if it would be unbearable to fall asleep that way, thus giving up comfort and rest and sacrifice for some sense of pseudo-natural beauty. Media surrounding obsessive beauty routines seem to be taken literally instead of as a critique against it. I remember when season 2 of Euphoria was released and many girls spoke about how Cassie's extreme early morning beauty routine matched their own, or saw it and then decided that they wanted to emulate it, despite the entire point of that scene illustrating her descent into insanity over wanting to impress a boy that didn't even want her, and the sacrifices she was willing to make to fit into the societal beauty standard no matter how much it took from her own time and life. Most of us believe our appearance is crucial to identity. Girls as young as 3 judge character based on body shape, and young women would rather be thin than smart. I reckon that if I fitted into size 10 jeans, I would be happier. I would rather have that than straight A's. Attaining the ideal matters more than almost anything else, and girls prioritize their bodies over their health. Men too are feeling the pressure, and for all of us, bodies matter more, and failure to comply to the beauty ideal is costly and increasingly political. The process of worrying about our bodies, striving, succeeding, failing, and striving again is normal and continual. It is a background condition of our lives, a preoccupation of daily conversation, and increasingly dominating of our thoughts and habits. It is core to the way we structure our lives and our very selves. We are our bodies and our bodies are ourselves, and no matter how much success we have, we ultimately fail. We sag, bulge, wrinkle, and crumple. No matter what we do, thinness, firmness, smoothness, and youth cannot be maintained. I wish that the film had emphasized how challenging it is to detach from the constant pursuit of beauty, which they do, but in a way that seemed to be deeply internal to the individual characters and detached from many of the influences that would lead them to become that way. Neither of them would exist with that obsession in a vacuum. Revisiting the concept of multiple selves, the desire to be beautiful and thus good, and how deeply it is ingrained in our identity, their pursuit of beauty is so demanding that, if allowed, it would consume and become one's entire being. The substance brilliantly visualizes this through the physical splitting of selves. Most women exist with these two dual selves, oscillating between them as they push against and try to destroy the other. Although they are one, they cannot coexist. Ultimately, only one can prevail. We must either succumb to the pursuit of the unattainable, suffering forever, or find some way to heal and let go. Upon reaching an age where Elizabeth experiences this violent inadequacy of aging, she yearns for a younger body. The substance appears to be the sole solution. She can reclaim her youth, her vitality, and thus Sue is born, her name an homage to the timelessness of old Hollywood and the archetypal Lolita character. Initially, there's love between these two versions, as they share the same experiences, memories, beliefs, and desires, albeit in different bodies. At first, they are one. Sue tenderly cares for her other self, placing a blanket under her unconscious head. However, they quickly become estranged, treating each other as entirely separate people. Sue steals from Elizabeth, making reckless decisions while intoxicated, literally and figuratively sapping life from her older self to revel in her youth. This directly speaks to the destructive behaviors we engage in when we're younger, which profoundly impact our aging bodies. In retrospect, we may resent or even hate our younger selves for these actions, again viewing our past selves as almost entirely separate individuals. They are constantly told from an unknown voice that they are one. They must remember that they are one, but are consistently and entirely unable to. Why? Because they're not, at least not anymore.
You go into a cubicle on Earth.
Yeah.
A scanner maps the state of all the cells in your brain and body,
Yeah.
destroying your brain and body while it does it. Then the information is beamed, say, to Mars, where a replicator makes a perfect organic copy of your brain and body. Someone wakes up on Mars
Yeah.
thinking he's you, exactly like you in character, memory,
Yeah.
everything. Now, many people assume that it is just a way of traveling. I mean, they follow Star Trek and so on. I think it's not too hard to show that you're making a mistake if you think, oh yes, it would be me waking up on Mars.
Yes.
Suppose I enter the cubicle again on Earth.
Yeah.
Press the button, nothing seems to happen.
Yeah.
I walk out. What's gone wrong? Isn't working. Technician says, we've been having some trouble, he says, with these machines.
Yeah.
Though it records your states accurately, it damages the bodies that it scans. In a few days, I'm afraid to say, you'll be dead. But don't worry, you on Mars will take up where you leave off. Your book will be finished, your children cared for, all your ambitions will be fulfilled.
If I was in his shoes, it wouldn't matter to me that my copy on Mars had all my memories. I would still be going to die.
While the scenario described by the philosopher Derek Parfit in this clip isn't entirely identical to the division of the self and the substance, it offers insight into why the split selves are completely incapable of remembering that they are indeed one, as the omniscient voice constantly tries to remind them. As time passes, they diverge in memory and experience, with the other becoming either something to feed on or an object of hatred and sabotage. They perceive each other not as two integral parts of a whole self, but rather as rivals. If you were confronted with an exact clone of yourself, one who was exactly like you in every way, you would still believe that you were yourself, and equally, they would have every reason to believe that they were the real person too. You'd likely be unconcerned about your clone continuing your life on Mars, focusing instead on your own impending demise. Even with identical memories, there is still separation, and the one within the self will always feel that they are the authentic self. As I mentioned earlier, this perfectly exemplifies how intense our society's beauty standards have become. Not only do we feel that we are in competition with others who may be younger or more beautiful, but we can even feel that in some abstract way we are in competition with ourselves. Whether we wish we were as skinny as we used to be or yearn for the health and mobility of youth while resenting our younger self for not doing more, we struggle to find inner peace. This is why Elizabeth is willing to terminate Sue, but at the last second she doesn't. Why? I believe that the film wanted to emphasize how, again, pursuing and attaining beauty can supersede even the instinctual human desire for survival. It has really become that intense. Sue is Elizabeth's only remaining chance at youth and beauty, and she can't bear to give it up, even while knowing that it will inevitably kill her. In interviews for Coralie's debut feature film, Revenge, she consistently characterizes the protagonist Jen as a Lolita-type character. But when she explains this, she makes it abundantly clear that this isn't who Jen actually is, but rather a projection imposed upon her by the men in the film. These men reduce and objectify her entire being to the Lolita archetype, as if viewing her through their own metaphorical heart-shaped sunglasses. When it becomes evident that Jen's complexity exceeds this simple and objectifying projection placed upon her, they decide to get rid of her by killing her. Coralie's fascination with the Lolita archetype seems to stem not from romanticizing this type of character, but rather as a means of exposing the archetype as a mere projection thrust upon certain types of women, a projection that is far removed from who they actually are. Men's desire to objectify and simplify women aligns with this archetype, which illustrates their view of the idealized female form. Yet, as Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita shows, the Lolita is never real. It's a label placed onto women and girls, with its characteristics being entirely imaginary. To me, it feels that the natural opposite to the Lolita archetype would be the hag. Both are fictional constructs imposed on women by men and media. In The Substance, Coralie further explores this dichotomy of the self, allowing the characters to embody these contrasting female archetypes as they diverge, Sue as the Lolita and Elizabeth as the hag. One definition of hag states that it is an ugly and malicious old woman who practices witchcraft, with or without supernatural powers. Hags are often said to be aligned with the devil or the dead, sometimes appearing in the form of a beautiful woman. A succubus is a hag believed to engage in sexual intercourse with sleeping men, causing severe nightmares and leaving the victim exhausted. In this definition at least, the hag applies to both characters, as they oscillate between youth and old age through the use of the substance, a process that, while most likely rooted in scientific advancement, can be viewed as some sort of magic. But I refer to Elizabeth as the hag specifically because when looking at images of the stereotypical hag, you see silhouettes of older women or witches who look a lot like Elizabeth does at the end of her life, hunched over, wrinkled, covering herself in layers of cloth. It feels like a direct visual reference. And again, I go back to stories from our childhood where these two sort of archetypes are constantly depicted as enemies. In Snow White, the evil queen attempts to steal her beauty by killing her, much like Elizabeth tries to sabotage Sue by making their house a disaster by cooking disgusting meals, not unlike a witch and her cauldron, and also eventually trying to kill her with a mysterious, almost poisonous-looking liquid. The juxtaposition of youthful beauty and aged malevolence exists in countless fairy tales and other stories, making it clear to us why Sue and Elizabeth become natural adversaries as they increasingly grow to embody these archetypes. Ty West's film X offers a contemporary exploration of the dynamic that exists within these fairy tales. Upon its release, much of the horror that audiences talked about stemmed not from violence, but from their repulsion at Pearl wanting to engage in sexual acts, or just from seeing the body of an older woman. The elderly female body became the source of horror, reinforcing the trope of youth as morally good and old age as morally corrupt. While Pearl's actions definitely justify rooting for Maxine to survive, it also perfectly shows our tendency to equate youth with virtue, beauty, and strength, and old age with depravity. This was only made completely evident with the release of the prequel Pearl. In Pearl, we get to watch young Pearl as she struggles in her pursuit of fame and wanting to escape her predetermined fate of living on the farm she grew up on. Pearl exhibits the same sexual, violent, and murderous tendencies as she does in X. However, her youth and beauty seem to completely absolve her. Instead, viewers loved her, related to her, and rooted for her despite her malicious actions, becoming as loved or perhaps even more loved than Maxine. Why do so many people find older women and their bodies to not only be disgusting but also horrifying? There's an entire horror subgenre known as hagsploitation that centers around this idea, and strangely enough, or perhaps not strange at all, there isn't a version of this that exists for aging men. Both the Lolita and the hag are fabricated archetypes, labels imposed on women by men with no basis in reality. These constructs serve to further dehumanize women and insidiously pit them against one another. It is only when Sue also starts to transition into the hag herself that the Lolita crumbles, and she has empathy for her other self and also hatred for her current aging self. Then she decides that the only option is to make the split again and sacrifice herself in hopes of regaining her Lolita youthfulness, only to become Monstro instead. The initial sign of Sue's deterioration is the scene where her teeth begin to fall out. Including this as the catalyst for her descent was brilliant, as it accurately portrays the extremity of emotion that you'd experience when starting to lose control over your body and self. Dreams of teeth falling out are remarkably common, and one interpretation suggests that they symbolize a sense that a person is losing control. Some research does lend credibility to this idea. Many studies suggest that dreams can help people gain insight into their emotions, and having teeth fall out could feel like things are out of control. One study found that college students who had teeth loss dreams were also more likely to feel a loss of control over their lives. As someone who used to have constant dreams about my teeth falling out, I can attest to the sheer horror of these nightmares. I would jolt awake in a state of panic, paralyzed by the fear that my teeth falling out would lead to the detachment of other parts of my body, a fear that materializes for Sue in the film. This serves as a masterful physical manifestation of the fear of aging. It somehow manages to capture the sensation of watching your body deteriorate before your very eyes and without your consent. This can lead to panic, grasping at anything to keep yourself afloat, just as Elizabeth does in the beginning of the film when, out of sheer desperation, she reached for the substance. But no matter what skincare you apply, what surgeries you get, what supplements you take, what substances you get, you will never ever have complete control. And as Coralie states in an interview, the movie was meant to express everything that I felt needed to be said without any restrictions, because the movie is fundamentally about the violence of control, how we're told to be delicate. Think of the past when women had to wear clothes that tightened everything up. I really wanted to let it out. When the final transformation arrives, it felt quite intuitive to bring the character ultimate relief. Ironically, it's when she's totally deformed and monstrous that she doesn't care what she looks like. In fact, it's the only time she looks in the mirror and kind of likes what she sees. That's the moment when she finally feels like she deserves to go out in public, no matter what she looks like. We hide behind our polished smiles, and I wanted the character to unleash those hidden anxieties. The audience, which stands in for all of us as a society, screams and hates her for this, and I wanted to portray how violent that reaction can be, that the only real moment of relief that she has is when she doesn't have a body anymore. I think that says it all.